She arrived late, alone, wearing plain blue scrubs with a faded coffee stain near the collar. No uniform, no medals, no name on the program. The Redstone Veterans Memorial stood packed with dress blues, polished boots, and folded flags, and she slipped in at the back like she had no right to be there at all. Armed security spotted her in under 2 minutes. The head officer crossed the grass in long strides, hand raised, voice low but cutting. "Ma'am, this is a closed ceremony. You need to leave." She didn't argue. She turned to go. And that's when 7 elite military K9s shattered perfect formation and ran straight to her, all at once, leaving decorated officers standing in frozen, open-mouthed silence. "Who is that woman?" someone whispered. Nobody had an answer. Nobody knew the ceremony was about to rip open a lie that had been buried for 8 years. If this story already has you gripped, please subscribe to my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The ceremony was supposed to start at 10. By 9:52, the last of the folding chairs had been filled. The honor guard had taken position at the base of the granite memorial wall, and the K9 unit, 7 dogs and their handlers, stood in a clean line along the left flank of the crowd. Families sat in rows behind a low rope barrier, wives, mothers, grown children in church clothes. Holding programs they kept smoothing with their palms, like that might make the day easier to hold. Iron Ridge, Colorado in October had the kind of cold that came sideways. The mountains to the west were already getting their first real snow, and the wind off the foothills cut through wool coats and made flags snap loud enough to sound like small gunshots. Nobody moved. Nobody complained. These were people who had learned to stand still in discomfort. Colonel Dara Whitfield stood at the podium near the memorial wall, checking her notes one last time. She was the one who had organized this day. 3 months of coordination with families, the base public affairs office, and the K9 unit that had flown in from Fort Lavelle just for this occasion. The dogs had served in Kandahar province alongside the 2nd Ranger Reconnaissance Detachment 8 years ago. Their handlers had changed twice over since then, but the dogs, the ones that had survived, were old now, gray around their muzzles, moving with the careful dignity of animals who had done something hard and never forgotten it. Today was for Lieutenant Marcus Doherty, 29 years old when he died. 2 tours, a Purple Heart he never got to wear, and a letter he had written before his final deployment that his mother, Vera Doherty, had kept in a shoebox under her bed for 8 years and only now agreed to have read aloud. Whitfield tapped her notes flat and looked out at the crowd. That was when she saw the woman at the back. She stood near the tree line, about 30 meters from the nearest chair, as though she hadn't decided yet whether she was attending or just passing by. Blue scrubs. A navy fleece pulled over the top, unzipped. Work shoes, the kind that nurses wore through 12-hour shifts. She was somewhere in her mid-30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back not neatly but practically, the way someone pulled their hair back when they were between things and didn't have time to think about it. There was a scar along the left side of her jaw, faint but there, the kind that had stopped being visible to whoever wore it. She didn't have a program. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was just watching the memorial wall. Sergeant First Class Gideon Farr noticed her about 30 seconds after Whitfield did. Farr was the senior security coordinator for the event. He'd been doing these memorials for 4 years since a knee injury ended his field time, and his read on crowd behavior was automatic by now. He clocked the woman, clocked the absence of a visitor badge, clocked the fact that she wasn't with any of the families he'd checked in that morning. He crossed the grass toward her. The ceremony was 90 seconds from starting. "Ma'am," he kept his voice down, mindful of the families nearby. "This is a credentialed event. Can I see your badge?" She looked at him with a kind of patience that wasn't unfriendly, exactly, but wasn't warm either. The patience of someone who had been through enough checkpoints that one more didn't rattle her. "I don't have one," she said. "I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if I was coming until this morning. I'm going to need you to step back past the barrier rope then, or I can have someone check the registry if you're a family affiliate." "I'm not on the registry." "Then, ma'am, I need you to clear the area." He said it gently. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. But when a second officer positioned himself to her left, and the body language shifted from conversation to escort, the family members in the nearest chairs began to turn around, and a few of the handlers along the K9 line glanced over. The woman nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and turned to go. That was when the first dog moved. His name was Rook, a Belgian Malinois, 8 years old, with a graying chest and one ear that had been partially torn and healed unevenly years ago. He was standing perfectly still in the K9 line when something changed in him. Not a sound, not a command, and he turned his head toward the back of the crowd. His handler, specialist Thomas Vance, felt the leash go taut before he even processed what was happening. Rook, heel! Rook didn't heel. He pulled. Steady, deliberate, not frantic. Not the way dogs moved when they'd caught a scent they'd been trained to find, but the way dogs moved toward something they already knew. And then the second dog moved. Then the third. Within 8 seconds, all 7 K9s had broken formation. Leashes pulled taut, then slack as 3 handlers lost their grip entirely. The dogs weren't running wildly. They moved with a kind of focused, organized certainty that made the whole thing stranger, because military working dogs didn't do this, didn't abandon position, didn't ignore their handlers without an explanation that made sense. And this didn't make sense. This made every person in that crowd go completely quiet and still. They went straight to the woman in the blue scrubs. Not around her, not past her, to her. They circled her. Not aggressive, no raised hackles, no alarm, just close, pressing against her legs, lifting their heads toward her hands, and the old Malinois, Rook, sat down directly in front of her with something in his posture that a witness later described, awkwardly but accurately, as formal. The woman stood very still. Sergeant Farr had stopped walking. Behind him, across the crowd, nobody was moving. Vera Doherty had her hand over her mouth. Colonel Whitfield had stepped back from the podium. The honor guard hadn't moved because nobody had told them what to do, and there was no protocol for this. "Who is that?" someone said. Not loudly, just to the person next to them. The woman reached down and put her hand on Rook's head. The old dog leaned into it. She looked up and found the nearest handler, a young woman named Sergeant Priya Kaul, who was standing 10 feet away holding a slack leash and looking like she needed someone to tell her this was normal. The woman in the scrubs said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'll step back." "Don't." The voice came from behind Sergeant Kaul. A man in his late 40s had risen from a seat in the family section. He was wearing dress slacks and a flannel shirt, and his face had the particular texture of a man who spent a lot of time outdoors and had stopped sleeping well in middle age. His name was Patrick Doherty, Marcus's older brother, and he was staring at the woman in the scrubs with an expression that was half recognition and half something that looked like relief. "Don't step back," he said again. "You earned your place here more than anyone." Her name was Claire Rowan, and she had not planned to come. She'd driven 5 hours from the apartment in Salter City, where she worked ER triage at a small regional hospital that was perpetually understaffed, and she'd sat in her car in the parking lot of a gas station outside Iron Ridge for 20 minutes before she made herself start driving again. She hadn't told anyone she was going, she hadn't asked permission, hadn't contacted the organizers, hadn't looked up whether a former civilian contractor in bed would even be allowed near the ceremony. She wasn't even sure what she'd expected to find here. Maybe just the wall. Maybe just the names. She'd read about the rededication online 3 weeks ago. A brief notice in a Veterans Affairs newsletter she'd been subscribed to for years without ever commenting or responding to anything. The Redstone Memorial. The K9 unit. Lieutenant Marcus Doherty's final letter, to be read by family request. She'd read that sentence twice, and then she'd stared at the wall across from her kitchen table for a long time. Marcus's letter. She'd known Marcus. Not well. Not the way you knew someone from back home or from years of shared history. She'd known him the way you knew people in compressed, violent circumstances, fully and briefly, and in a way that didn't leave you. He'd had a habit of eating the crackers from his MREs and trading away everything else. He talked about his mother constantly. Not in a sentimental way, just matter-of-factly, like Vera Doherty was a fixed point in his orientation system, and he checked against her regularly. In the 3 days she'd spent treating wounded soldiers in a burning evacuation vehicle outside Corvalec Ridge, Marcus had helped her keep 2 men alive when she'd run out of IV line and had to improvise with what was in the vehicle's emergency kit. He hadn't had medical training. He'd just done exactly what she told him to do, without flinching, for hours. She hadn't been able to save him in the end. She hadn't been allowed to try. That was the part she didn't talk about. That was the part nobody had ever officially acknowledged. Not in the after-action report, not in the investigation that followed, not in anything with her name attached to it. The official record showed a clean evacuation order and a successful extraction with acceptable losses. It showed a commanding officer who had made a difficult call under fire and had been decorated for it 18 months later. It didn't show the radio. It didn't show the 6 minutes she'd asked for. Claire sat in the family section now because Patrick Doherty had walked over to the barrier and asked her to, and because she hadn't had the presence of mind to argue. Rook was still sitting beside her left leg. The other 6 dogs had returned to their handlers reluctantly, casting looks back in her direction that made at least 2 of the handlers visibly uneasy. Sergeant Farr had retreated. He wasn't sure what to do with what he'd just watched, and so he went back to his post and made a note on his clipboard and resolved to think about it after the ceremony. Colonel Whitfield returned to the podium, but something had shifted in the crowd. The families were looking at Claire now, not hostilely, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular attention you paid to someone who had just been recognized by a group of combat veterans in a way that defied easy explanation. 2 women in the row behind Patrick Doherty leaned together and murmured. A man in a VFW cap turned fully around in his chair to look at Claire and then turned back without saying anything. Claire stared at the memorial wall. The names were listed by unit and date. She found the Ranger Recon section without trying. She'd looked at it online enough times that she knew the layout already, knew the spacing, knew exactly where Marcus Doherty's name appeared between 2 others she also recognized. She put her hand flat on her knee and kept it there. "We gather today," Whitfield began, "not to say goodbye. That was done 8 years ago in harder circumstances than this. We gather to remember with the full truth of what these men and women were, what they chose, what they refused to give up." The wind moved through the trees behind the memorial. Somewhere off to the left, a child made a small sound and was immediately hushed. Lieutenant Marcus Doherty served 2 tours with the 2nd Ranger Reconnaissance Detachment. He was known by his unit as someone who led from the front and argued from the back, which is a polite way of saying he had opinions and was not shy about them. A sound moved through the crowd. Not quite a laugh, not quite not a laugh. He left a letter in the care of his family before his final deployment. His mother, Vera Doherty, has decided after 8 years that today is the right day to hear it. We're grateful to her for that. Vera Doherty was small, in her late 60s, with silver hair and a dark green coat that looked like it had been bought for a different occasion a long time ago. She sat in the front row and looked at the wall and nowhere else. A chaplain's assistant, young, maybe 22, stepped to a secondary microphone with a printed sheet. The letter began simply. It had the structure of someone who wrote better than they thought they did and wasn't trying to prove it. It talked about the unit. It talked about the dogs, specifically, the Malinois named Rook, who would steal food off your plate if you weren't watching, and the big German shepherd named Callum, who was afraid of thunder despite having 0 reaction to active fire, which Marcus found both hilarious and philosophically interesting. And then it said, "If anything happens to me, I want people to know about the woman who stayed. Her name is Claire Rowan. She was the trauma nurse attached to our unit for the Korvalik operation, and when the call came to pull back, she didn't. She stayed in that vehicle with Erickson and Halverson, and she kept working while command made the decision it made. I don't know what the official record says. I don't always trust official records, but I know what I saw, and I know who asked for 6 more minutes and didn't get them, and I know who those 6 minutes would have been for." The chaplain's assistant stopped reading. The silence afterward had a texture to it, not the polished silence of ceremony, but the rougher kind, the kind that preceded something. Claire's hand was still flat on her knee. She was looking at the wall and not blinking, and 2 rows back a woman whispered to her husband, "Is she—" And he put his hand on her arm and they both just watched. Patrick Doherty turned to look at Claire directly. She didn't look back at him. She was aware of being looked at by a significant portion of the crowd, and she dealt with it the way she dealt with most things, by not moving and not making it about her and waiting for the moment to pass. But the moment wasn't passing, because on the other side of the crowd, across the rope barrier, a man in dress uniform had gone very still. He was in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being looked at in rooms where looking at him meant something. Silver at his temples, jaw that had squared with age without softening. His decorations were substantial, 4 rows on his chest. His rank insignia said Commander. The program listed him as Commander Nathan Briggs, retired, special guest attendee, and under his name in italics, decorated for valor, Corvalec Ridge Operation, 2016. He had gone still the moment the chaplain's assistant started reading Marcus's letter. He had gone paler when the name Claire Rowan was spoken aloud. And now he was staring at the woman in the blue scrubs with an expression that Claire, if she had been looking, would have recognized immediately. She'd seen it before on other faces in other circumstances. It was the look of a man watching something he thought he'd controlled come loose. He reached for his phone. Sergeant Farr, returning from a position near the tree line, caught the movement from his peripheral. An older man in dress uniform, fingers moving too quickly for a text, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the civilian near the family section. Farr didn't know what he was seeing yet, but he filed it. The chaplain's assistant had started reading again. I guess what I'm saying is, if it ever comes to a reckoning, and I think it should, I want her name in the room. She earned it. The rest of us just got to leave. Vera Doherty put her hands together in her lap and pressed them flat, like she was holding something in. And Claire Rowan finally looked away from the wall. She looked across the crowd, past the rows of folding chairs, past the families and the handlers and the honor guard. And her eyes stopped on Nathan Briggs without her having to search for him, as though she'd always known where he was, had clocked him the moment she arrived the way she clocked exits and obstructions and threats. Automatically, permanently, because some habits didn't turn off just because the war was over. He looked back at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Briggs turned and walked toward the parking lot. Claire watched him go. Patrick Doherty, who had been watching Claire, watched Briggs leave and then turned back to Claire and said, low, under the continuing words of his brother's letter, "You know him." It wasn't a question. Claire said after a moment, "He knows me." "Is that why you're here?" She thought about that. The honest answer was complicated in a way she didn't have language for right now, in this place, in front of these people. She said, "I came for Marcus, and for the wall." She paused. The rest of it just showed up. Rook, still beside her, shifted his weight and pressed his shoulder against her leg. Patrick looked at his brother's name on the memorial wall for a long moment. "He wrote that letter 6 weeks before he died," Patrick said. "He told me about you too. Said you were the kind of person who made other people remember what they were supposed to be." Claire didn't answer that. "He said you asked for 6 more minutes." Patrick's voice was level, carefully level, the way voices got when someone had been carrying something for 8 years and had learned how to carry it without shaking. "He said command denied it." "That's correct." "Did that cost people their lives?" The ceremony was still ongoing around them. Whitfield was speaking again. Logistics of the rededication, acknowledgement of donors, and the families were listening and the handlers were standing at ease, and the whole formal machinery of remembrance was moving forward. But in this little cluster of chairs, in this pocket of space, something else was happening entirely. Claire said, "I can't answer that in a way that would be fair to everyone involved." "That's an answer," Patrick said. She let that sit. Rook's ear twitched. He looked toward the parking lot. Briggs had been gone for 4 minutes. He hadn't come back. In his car, engine running, Nathan Briggs held his phone and read the text he'd sent 3 minutes ago and waited for a reply that had not come. He looked in his rearview mirror at the back edge of the ceremony, the flags still snapping in the cold, and he thought about everything he'd spent 8 years making sure would not come out in a room with witnesses and a microphone and a dead man's letter. He thought about a radio transmission. 6 words. His own voice, flat and certain. Negative. Withdraw immediately. That is final. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The reply said, "Too late. Military Inspector General Office was notified this morning. Someone filed a complaint. They're already looking." Briggs put the phone face down on the passenger seat. Outside, through the windshield, a crow landed on the parking lot barrier and tilted its head and looked at nothing. Inside the ceremony, Claire was listening to the final words of Marcus Doherty's letter, and Rook was still leaning against her leg, and Patrick Doherty was staring at the wall with his hands folded like a man in court, and the 7 K9s were all facing in the same direction, not at the memorial, not at the crowd, at the parking lot where Nathan Briggs sat with his engine running and his past finally, irrevocably in motion. The crow on the parking lot barrier lifted off without a sound, and Claire watched it go the way she watched most things, without moving her head, without making it obvious she was watching it all. The ceremony had shifted into its closing movements. Whitfield was back at the podium reading acknowledgments, the names of donors, the logistics of the memorial's new historical marker, the date of the public rededication reception in the spring. The practical machinery of grief, grinding forward, because it had to. Families were beginning to relax in their chairs in the small ways that people relaxed when the hardest emotional moment had passed, and they were now just waiting for permission to stand up and talk to each other and maybe find somewhere warm. Patrick Doherty hadn't moved. He was still looking at the wall, but his posture had changed, no longer contained and formal, but something tighter, more interior. Processing. Claire recognized that too. She'd watched enough people sit with hard information and try to figure out what to do with it, usually while something else demanded their attention. "What happened to you after?" he asked, not looking at her, still at the wall. "After Korvalek?" "Yeah." She thought about how to answer that honestly without making it a story about herself when this day was supposed to be about his brother. "I was separated from the contract embed program 6 weeks after we got back. Administrative decision, no formal charges, no hearing." She paused. "They called it a restructuring." Patrick made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I went back to nursing," she said. "Regional hospital work, ER triage mostly. It's what I know." "Do you like it?" The question caught her slightly off guard because it was the kind of thing people asked in normal conversation, and this was not normal conversation. She considered it genuinely. "Some days, the work is real. Patients don't care about your history." He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him in a way that went beyond the words. The honor guard had begun its final movement, the folding of the ceremonial flag, crisp and precise, each fold counted. Vera Doherty was watching it with the careful attention of a woman who had attended enough of these to know every step and still found it necessary to watch each one. "She doesn't know you're here," Patrick said, about his mother. "I didn't tell her. I wasn't sure if you'd actually come." "You were expecting me?" "I sent the notice to your old embed contact email 3 months ago. Figured it either bounced or you'd show up." He finally looked at her. "You showed up." Claire absorbed that. He'd known. He'd planned for this possibility. She felt something shift slightly in her read of him. He wasn't just a grieving brother. He was someone who had been sitting on Marcus's letter for 8 years and had finally decided to pull the thread and see what came loose. "Did you know about Briggs?" "I knew his name was in the original investigation file. I knew the investigation was closed in 11 days. Patrick's jaw moved. 11 days for an incident that killed 4 soldiers and injured 7. 11 days, and they called it resolved. It wasn't resolved. "No," he said flatly. "It was buried." The flag was folded now, a tight triangle of stars. The presenting officer walked it toward Vera Doherty with measured steps, and the crowd held the particular silence that a flag transfer produced in people, regardless of whether they'd ever served. Something in the formality of it that short-circuited regular breathing. Vera Doherty took the flag with both hands and held it against her chest. Claire looked away. She'd been at enough of these to know that this moment belonged entirely to Vera, and that watching it too long felt like trespassing. Her eyes went back to the parking lot. Briggs's car was still there, engine off now. She could see the faint shape of him through the rear window. Not moving, just sitting, waiting for something, or thinking, or both. She'd spent years trying not to think about Nathan Briggs, not because it didn't matter, because it mattered too much, and there was nothing she could do with it. The investigation had been closed before she could formally submit her own account. Her request for a second review had been denied without explanation. Her embed supervisor had told her, gently but clearly, that pursuing it would cost her the contract and possibly more, and that sometimes the smartest thing a person could do was understand which fights they could win. She hadn't agreed with that. But she'd been 26 and exhausted and alone in a processing office in Germany with paperwork in front of her that made it easy to sign and hard to refuse, and she had signed. She'd regretted it ever since. Not in the consuming way. She'd learned to keep it at a manageable distance, the way you learn to manage anything that didn't kill you outright, but didn't fully leave either. It lived in the part of her that woke up at 3 in the morning sometimes and ran through timelines. 6 minutes. She'd asked for 6 minutes. Erickson had still had a pulse. Halverson's airway had been clear. 6 minutes with the right pressure and the right positioning, and there was a real chance, not a guarantee, never a guarantee, but a real medical chance, that both of them could have been stabilized enough for transport. Negative. Withdraw immediately. That is final. She'd heard that voice in her sleep for 2 years after she came home. She'd eventually stopped hearing it quite so often, but she'd never stopped knowing what it meant. The ceremony concluded without drama. Whitfield gave a brief closing statement, the honor guard dispersed, and the formal part of the day dissolved into the quieter human part. People standing, stretching, finding each other, the low murmur of conversation returning like weather. The K9 handlers worked to settle their dogs, 3 of whom were still orienting toward Claire with a persistence that was becoming logistically inconvenient. Specialist Vance had Rook on a short leash and kept glancing at Claire with an expression caught somewhere between professional concern and genuine bewilderment. She walked over to him before he could come to her. "I'm sorry about the disruption," she said. "I didn't call to him." "I know you didn't," Vance said. He was young, mid-20s, with the attentive posture of someone who had been well-trained and was currently encountering something his training hadn't covered. "He hasn't done anything like that in the 4 years I've handled him. He's a very controlled animal. That's what makes it—" He stopped. "Did you know him? Before?" "His first deployment, Korvalek." Vance looked at Rook, then back at Claire. "He was working that operation." "Yes." "So he—" Vance started to say something and then recalibrated. He was too professional to finish the sentence with "remembered you" because that was anthropomorphizing in a way his training discouraged. But the alternative was that it wasn't memory, and he didn't have a better explanation. "He's been steady his whole career. Good temperament. Never a behavior break like this." Claire crouched down to Rook's level. The dog looked at her with the particular directness that working dogs had. Not submissive, not demanding, just fully present in a way that most humans never quite managed. She put her hand under his chin. He didn't flinch. "Good dog," she said quietly, and it came out more worn than she'd intended, like the words had been carried a long way. Vance watched this and said nothing. When she straightened up, Sergeant Call was standing a few feet behind Vance with the German shepherd named Callum on her left side. Callum was the one Marcus had mentioned in the letter, the thunder-phobic one. He was 9 now, nearly ancient for an active working dog, and he looked at Claire with the same steady recognition that Rook had shown. Call said, "You were with them, in theater. Embedded trauma nurse, civilian contract." Call glanced at the memorial wall and back. "The letter." She stopped. Started again. "The letter mentioned 6 minutes." "Yes." "What happened in those 6 minutes?" Claire looked at her evenly. "We didn't get them." Call absorbed that. She was sharp. Claire could see it in the way she held the silence, not filling it with the reassurances or deflections that people used when they were uncomfortable. She just let the answer be what it was. "The man who left," Call said. "Dress uniform, silver commander insignia." "Briggs." "He was in the program, is that right? Part of the Korvalek command structure?" "He was the ranking field commander." Call looked toward the parking lot. From where they were standing, Briggs's car was visible, still parked, still occupied. "He hasn't left," she said. "No," Claire said. "He hasn't." She didn't explain why. She wasn't entirely sure herself. Maybe he was waiting to see how the day resolved. Maybe he was working his phone, calling in whatever favors he had left to call in. Maybe he was just sitting there with the weight of what Marcus's letter had just done in a room full of people who were now going to have questions. 8 years was a long time to keep a lid on something, but lids had pressure limits. Patrick Doherty appeared at her elbow. He had his mother with him. Vera Doherty was smaller up close. The kind of small that wasn't frail but compact, like a person who had been made efficiently and had used every part. She had the flag under her left arm, and she was looking at Claire with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. "Patrick told me who you are," she said. Her voice was steady and direct, the way Marcus's had been. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Doherty. I mean that. I know you do." Vera looked at her for a long moment. "Marcus wrote about you in other letters too, not just the one we read today. He said you were the one who didn't leave." Claire felt something in her chest that she didn't have a name for and didn't try to name. "I wanted to stay longer." "I know that too." Vera shifted the flag in her arms. "He said you asked. He said they said no." Her eyes were clear and dry. She'd done her crying at some other time, in some other place, and what was left was the bedrock. Is that what's in those 6 minutes? The truth about what happened? Part of it, yes. The rest of it? Claire said, the rest of it is in a radio log that should have been part of the investigation record and wasn't. Vera was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the trees again, and a scatter of dried leaves came down across the memorial stones. Is it too late to change that? Before Claire could answer, her phone buzzed in her fleece pocket. She glanced at it. Unknown number, Colorado Springs area code. She let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again immediately. She stepped a half-pace away from the Dohertys and answered. Rowan. Ms. Rowan, this is Major Diane Sessler, Military Inspector General's Office, Fort Lavelle. The voice was brisk, not unkind. I apologize for the timing. I'm at the event site. I arrived approximately 40 minutes ago. I was hoping we might speak privately before you leave. Claire scanned the crowd without making it obvious she was scanning. She found a woman in civilian clothes near the memorial wall's eastern edge. Mid-40s, short gray streaked hair, the posture of someone in the military who was trying not to look like military. The woman was already looking at her. When Claire's eyes landed on her, she gave a small, controlled nod. I see you, Claire said. Good. There's been a complaint filed with this office. I can't get into details on an open line, but I'd like you to know that your presence here today was noted, and there are people in this office who have been watching a particular case file for approximately 3 years waiting for new information to surface. Claire turned slightly away from the Dohertys, keeping her voice level. 3 years. Yes, ma'am. The file was never officially closed despite what the external record indicates. I need 15 minutes of your time before this crowd disperses. Through the crowd, from the direction of the parking lot, she heard a car door. She turned. Briggs was out of his vehicle. He was walking, not toward the ceremony, but toward the memorial wall, directly, with the deliberate stride of a man who had made a decision and was moving before he could reconsider it. He was on his phone. His face had the particular blankness of someone managing their expression under stress, which meant it was slightly too still, slightly too controlled. He was heading toward Vera Doherty. Claire said into the phone, I need 2 minutes, and ended the call before Sessler could respond. She moved. Not running. There was no cause to run, no immediate threat, and running through a crowd at a military memorial would create exactly the kind of scene she had spent the last 2 hours trying not to create. But she moved with the purpose and pace of someone who covered ground quickly when they needed to, and she closed the distance between herself and the Dohertys before Briggs had crossed half the memorial grounds. Patrick saw Briggs coming and went still. Vera turned at Patrick's stillness and tracked the direction of his attention, and then she saw Briggs too, and Claire watched Vera Doherty recognize him, slowly, then all at once. And the expression that moved across Vera's face was not grief and not anger, but something older and harder than both. Briggs reached them. He stopped about 6 feet out and looked at Vera like he'd prepared what he was going to say, and was now discovering the preparation was inadequate. Mrs. Doherty, he started, I want to say, I know who you are, Vera said. He blinked. I came to pay my respects. I know who you are, she said again, and this time her voice had something in it that stopped him completely. Marcus wrote your name down. He wrote what you did. He wrote the date and the time and the exact words of the order you gave. She held the flag tighter against her chest. Did you know about the letter? Briggs looked at Claire. Claire said nothing. I only want to explain, he started. Explain it to them, Patrick said. He was pointing, not at his mother, not at Claire, but past Briggs, toward the east edge of the memorial grounds, where Major Sessler had moved from her position at the wall and was now walking toward them with 2 other individuals who had the unmistakable bearing of people who were at this event in an official capacity that had nothing to do with paying respects. Briggs turned and saw them. The color left his face in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Rook, who had been sitting quietly at Vance's side 20 feet away, made a low sound. Not aggressive, not alarm, just sound, the kind that marked a change in the air the way dogs marked things that humans felt a second later. And Claire stood between Briggs and the Dohertys without having planned to stand there, the November wind off the Rockies cutting straight through her fleece, the memorial wall solid behind her, and she looked at Nathan Briggs with the accumulated weight of 8 years of silence and 6 minutes that had never stopped mattering, and she said, quiet enough that only he could hear, "They already have the complaint. Whatever you were going to say to her, you should have thought about it 8 years ago." Briggs looked at her with something moving behind his eyes that might have been, in some earlier version of himself, something like shame. Sessler reached them. She produced a credentials case, showed it briefly, and said, "Commander Briggs, I'm Major Diane Sessler, IG office. I'd like to speak with you privately, if you'll follow me." It was phrased as a request. It was not a request. Briggs looked once more at Claire, then at Vera, then at the memorial wall behind them all, the names in the stone, the flags in the cold wind. He went with Sessler without speaking. Patrick exhaled slowly beside Claire, and it was the exhale of a man who had been holding his breath for most of a decade. Vera was still looking at the place Briggs had been standing, the flag pressed against her chest. Then she looked at Claire, and something in her expression shifted. Not softer, exactly, but more direct. "He was going to try to get ahead of it," she said. "Wasn't he?" "Probably." "Did he think I didn't know? That I hadn't read every line of every letter Marcus ever sent home?" Claire didn't answer that because it wasn't a question that needed answering. After a moment, Vera said, "Will they actually do something, or is this the kind of thing that gets handled quietly and put away again?" It was the question Claire had been holding for 8 years, and she still didn't have a clean answer to it. It depends on what's still in the archive. If the radio logs survived, if there's original signal record from the withdrawal sequence, then it's harder to put away quietly. And if they didn't survive, then it's testimony against testimony. Claire paused. But there are 6 handlers who were in theater that day, and Marcus's letter is now part of a public ceremony record. She looked at the wall. It's harder to erase a thing after it's been read aloud to 200 people. Vera nodded once. It wasn't satisfaction. It was acknowledgement. The recognition of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between justice and the beginning of justice, and who could hold both without confusing them. Major Sessler and Briggs had moved to the far edge of the parking lot, away from the remaining families. The 2 officials who had accompanied Sessler were standing at careful distances, not escorting, not restraining, but positioned in the way that people were positioned when leaving was technically still an option, but practically wasn't. Claire watched this from across the memorial grounds and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not relief, not victory, not anything clean. More like the sensation of a door finally swinging open on a room you'd been standing outside for years. The room might be empty. The room might hold everything. You couldn't know until you went in. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked at the screen before answering. The text was from a number she didn't recognize. No name. Fort Lavelle area code. It said, "Radio logs from Korvalek Ridge operations, August 14-17, 2016, archived under classified signal records, subfile 7 Delta. IG office pulled them this morning. The withdrawal sequence is intact. All of it." She read it twice. She looked up at the mountains to the west, white-capped and indifferent, the sky behind them going the pale gray of late afternoon. She looked at Vera Doherty, who was watching her with the patient, unreadable attention of a woman who had been waiting 8 years and knew how to wait a little longer. Claire turned the phone over in her hand, and she thought about a burning ambulance in a mountain pass, and 2 men she hadn't been able to save, and a voice on the radio saying that is final, and 8 years of living with the distance between what happened and what the record said. Then she looked back down at the text. All of it. She was still looking at those 3 words, when a second message arrived from the same number. And this one was not about radio logs or archived files or the IG office or anything procedural at all. It was 4 words. And the 4 words changed everything she had assumed about who else had been looking. The 4 words were, "Halverson is still alive." Claire read them again, then again. Her brain did the thing it did in triage. Stripped sentiment, went straight to information processing, because sentiment was a luxury and information was not. Halverson. Private First Class Denny Halverson, 22 years old, from a small town outside Billings, Montana. Penetrating abdominal trauma, secondary hemorrhage, unconscious but breathing when she'd last had her hands on him. When the withdrawal order came, she'd been 12 minutes into a field hemorrhage control sequence that needed 18 to be viable. She'd been told he didn't make it. She'd been told both of them, Halverson and Erickson, had died in the vehicle when it burned. She'd been told. By whom, she hadn't thought to question at the time, because she'd been in shock and running on 36 hours without sleep, and they'd shown her paperwork with both names on a casualty list. She stood at the edge of the Redstone Memorial, with her thumb hovering over the screen and her heart doing something irregular that she recognized as adrenaline hitting a system that had been running on managed calm for the past 3 hours. She typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came in under 15 seconds. "Someone who's been watching the same file Sessler has. I can't identify myself by text. Are you still on site?" She looked up. Sessler was still in the parking lot with Briggs and the two officials. The families were dispersing in clusters, heading toward cars, toward the small reception tent that had been set up near the main gate. Patrick Doherty was beside her, and he was watching her face with the focused attention of a man who had learned to read other people's changes in expression because it was often the first information available. "What is it?" he asked. She showed him the screen. He read it again. His jaw worked. "Halverson," he said. "Marcus mentioned him. He was one of the two I was working on when the order came." Patrick looked at her with the full weight of what that meant. "They told you he died?" "Yes." "And he didn't?" "I don't know yet." She typed, "Still on site." "Where are you?" The reply, "Northeast corner of the parking area, gray Suburban. Come alone." She looked toward the northeast corner. There was a gray Suburban parked at the far end of the lot, away from the other vehicles, partially under the shadow of a large cottonwood that had dropped most of its leaves. She could see someone in the driver's seat, but not clearly. "I need to follow up on something," she told Patrick. "Don't tell Sessler I've moved yet." "Claire, it's probably fine," she said, which was the kind of thing you said when you didn't actually know and needed to act anyway. She was already walking. The distance across the parking lot took about 90 seconds, and she used them to think through the calculus. Unknown sender, specific information about Halverson that wasn't public record, knowledge of her presence at the site, ability to see the ceremony from a position that meant they'd been here long enough to track her movements. Either someone with genuine insider access to records she'd never been allowed to see, or an elaborate misdirection from someone who wanted her moving away from Sessler. She decided the first option was more likely because the second required too much preparation for unclear gain. She reached the Suburban and knocked on the passenger window. The window came down. The man inside was in his late 50s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent significant time at elevation and in wind. He was in civilian clothes, brown jacket, plain shirt, but his posture was the posture of a career military man, in the same way that posture was a thing you never entirely stopped carrying. He had a retired military ID and a manila envelope on the passenger seat. "Ms. Rowan," he said, "my name is Colonel Gerald Prast, retired. I was the Signals Intelligence Officer for the 2nd Ranger Recon Detachment at Korvalik Ridge." She processed that. Signals intelligence, radio traffic. He was the man who would have handled the communications archive. "You sent the text about the radio logs." "The first one, yes." He picked up the envelope and held it out. "The second text was from a different phone. My son-in-law. He's a paralegal at the IG office, and he sent it without my knowledge, which we'll discuss later." He paused. "It's accurate, though. Halverson is alive. He's been in the VA system under a different case classification. Severe TBI, multiple reconstructive surgeries, 8 months of inpatient rehab. He's been living in Tucson for the past 4 years. Claire took the envelope, but didn't open it. "Why is he listed as KIA? Prast looked out the windshield. "Because someone submitted a corrected casualty report 6 days after Korvalik, and his name was moved from the critical list to the deceased column before the field records were fully consolidated. By the time anyone would have caught it, the investigation window had closed and the records were archived." "Someone," she said. The correction was submitted under Briggs's authorization code. The wind rocked the Suburban slightly. In the distance, Claire could hear voices from the reception tent, the murmur of people drinking bad coffee and finding the words to talk to each other about something that didn't have easy language. "He falsified a casualty report," she said. "He altered an administrative record during an active investigation, which has several overlapping legal implications depending on which statute you're charging under." Prast's voice was flat, in the way that people's voices got flat when they were being precise about something that enraged them. The effect was to remove a living witness from the record and place him in a category of persons who could not provide testimony. Claire opened the envelope. Inside was a printed copy of a signal log, 12 pages, dense with timestamp codes and transmission identifiers, the formatting she remembered from her embed briefings. She didn't need to read all of it. She went to the section she needed. August 16, 2016, 0340 hours local. The withdrawal sequence. She found her own call sign. Echo 7 actual, which was the trauma nurse embedded position. She found the request. 6 minutes. Request extended extraction window. 2 critical patients stable for transport with additional stabilization time. She found Briggs's response. It was exactly what she remembered. Word for word. Negative. Withdraw immediately. That is final. But there was more below it. A second transmission she hadn't known about, sent 4 minutes later on a secondary channel while she'd still been in the vehicle. Briggs's call sign to the base operations commander, Echo 7, has been evacuated. All personnel clear. Execute burn protocol on vehicle. He'd reported her out of the vehicle 4 minutes before she actually left, before she'd had any indication the order was about to be enforced physically, before the extraction team had been redirected away from her position. She had made it out because she'd heard the extraction team pulling back and understood what was happening and moved on her own. Not because anyone had come for her, because she'd heard the sound of people leaving and had understood immediately and correctly that she had perhaps 90 seconds before the vehicle was no longer accessible. She stood in the cold with 12 pages of signal log in her hand and understood for the first time the full architecture of what Briggs had done. He hadn't just denied her request. He'd filed a false status report to make sure no one came back to check on her. If she'd stayed with the patients another 4 minutes, if she'd pushed past the withdrawal order even briefly, she would have been inside a burning vehicle with no extraction team and no one who officially knew she was still there. He hadn't just abandoned the wounded. He tried to ensure there was no surviving witness to the abandonment. He knew I was still in there, she said. Yes. And he filed the all clear anyway. Yes. She lowered the papers. Her hands were steady. She noted this with a clinical part of her brain because it was the kind of detail that mattered. She was functioning. She was clear. She was not going to handle this badly in a parking lot in Colorado in front of a retired colonel she'd met 4 minutes ago. Halverson, she said. Does he know? That he's listed as KIA in the official record? No, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't know he doesn't officially exist as a survivor. He came home through a non-standard VA intake process, and he's had enough cognitive impact from the TBI that the administrative history of his case classification wasn't something he was in a position to navigate. Prast paused. He's recovered substantially in the last 2 years. He can speak. He can function. He remembers parts of what happened. Parts. He remembers you, Prast said. He told his VA therapist that the only thing he remembered clearly from the vehicle was a woman's voice, telling him to stay still, and that she was going to keep his blood inside his body until transport arrived. He said it without expression, but the plainness of it landed hard. Exact words, apparently. Stay still. I'm keeping your blood inside your body until transport arrives. He thought he'd dreamed it for 3 years. Claire looked at the mountains. She had said that to him. She remembered saying it because she'd been talking constantly, to both of them, keeping them in the here and now. And at some point she'd run out of clinical language and had defaulted to the plainest truth she had, which was that she was there and she was working and she needed him to stay as still as he could manage. She folded the signal log and put it back in the envelope. Sessler needs to see this, she said. She already knows about the radio logs. She doesn't know about Halverson yet. Prast started the Suburban's engine. Not to leave, just the heat, the temperature dropping as the sun flattened toward the western ridgeline. The IG complaint that was filed this morning named Briggs specifically and cited the Korvalek investigation closure as irregular. It was filed by someone in this office who has been building the case for 3 years. He glanced at her. It wasn't filed by me. I didn't know it was coming until I saw Sessler's vehicle in the lot this morning. Then who filed it? Prast looked at her steadily. Sergeant First Class Gideon Farr, the event security coordinator. She turned that over. Farr, the man who had walked across the grass to ask for her badge, who had stood back when the dogs broke formation, who had been watching Briggs in the crowd with the practiced observation of someone who knew what he was looking for. He's IG, she said. He's been detailed to the IG field office for the past 2 years while maintaining his event security cover. He's been at 3 Korvalek-adjacent commemorations in the past 18 months, watching who showed up and how they behaved. Prast almost smiled. It wasn't warm. He's very good at his job. He tried to remove me from the ceremony. Standard protocol. He couldn't break cover by giving you a pass he wasn't authorized to issue. He was hoping you'd either leave quietly or, as it turned out, that something else would make your presence undeniable. He paused. The dogs were not part of his plan. Across the parking lot, she could see Sessler and Briggs still in conference. But the body language had changed. Briggs was no longer standing. He was sitting on the low concrete barrier at the parking lot's edge, and his posture had collapsed out of its earlier rigidity into something more like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally been told to put it down. One of the officials with Sessler was on a phone. The other was taking notes. Claire said, "I need to talk to Sessler. Now. Not in 20 minutes. Now." "Yes," Prast agreed. "You do." She got out of the Suburban with the envelope in her hand and walked back across the parking lot. And this time she wasn't managing her pace or her expression because there was no one left to perform composure for. The signal log was 12 pages. Halverson was in Tucson. Farr had been building this case for 3 years. The radio logs were intact. She had been waiting 8 years for a convergence she'd stopped believing would actually come. And it was happening in a parking lot in Iron Ridge, Colorado on a Thursday in November, with her wearing coffee-stained scrubs and carrying someone else's evidence, and she was not going to waste it. Sessler saw her coming. The major broke from the conversation with Briggs and walked to intercept Claire about 30 feet out, creating distance from Briggs by design. Up close, Sessler had the look of someone who functioned well on less sleep than was reasonable and had made peace with that some years ago. Her eyes went to the envelope immediately. "Signal log," Claire said, and handed it over. Sessler took it, opened it, scanned the first page. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way, but her eyes moved faster. She got to the secondary transmission, Briggs's false all clear on the secondary channel, and stopped moving entirely for 2 seconds. Then she looked up. "Where did you get this?" "Retired Colonel Gerald Prast, Gray Suburban, Northeast Corner. He was the SIGINT officer for 2nd Ranger Recon at Korvalek." Sessler looked toward the Suburban. "He's been holding this. He archived the signal records before they could be consolidated and potentially altered. He said he filed copies in 3 separate locations." Claire paused. "There's something else. Private First Class Denny Halverson listed KIA in the official Korvalek record. He's alive. He's in Tucson. He's been in the VA system under a misclassified case file since he came home." Sessler's stillness was total for a moment. Then, "Say that again." "Halverson is alive. The KIA classification was a record alteration. The correction was submitted under Briggs's authorization code 6 days after the operation." Claire held Sessler's gaze. "He removed a living witness from the official record during the investigation window." Sessler closed the envelope and looked over at Briggs on the concrete barrier. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the ground in front of him with the specific vacancy of a man who understood the geometry of what was closing around him and had stopped trying to calculate an exit. "I need to make some calls," Sessler said. "Right now. Please don't leave the site." "I'm not going anywhere." Sessler stepped away with her phone out, moving fast and purposeful toward the other officials. Claire turned back toward the memorial grounds. The reception tent was still up, still occupied. A thinning crowd, people beginning to leave in ones and twos, the social obligation of the day dissolving into the practical need to get back to cars and highways and the regular business of living. The K9 handlers were loading their dogs. Crates in the back of 2 military transport vans, the familiar ritual of post-deployment breakdown. Rook went into his crate last, and Claire watched Vance try to settle him, and watched Rook turn in the crate twice before lying down facing the direction of the memorial wall. Patrick Doherty found her before she found him. He came from the direction of the reception tent with 2 cups of coffee and held one out, and she took it because her hands were cold and she needed something to do with them. The coffee was terrible, the thin, overextended kind that came from an urn that had been running too long, but it was hot. "Sessler's making calls," he said. "Yes." "The man in the Suburban. I saw you walking back from there. Who is he?" She told him. Briefly, factually. She told him about the signal log and the secondary transmission and what it meant. She did not tell him about Halverson. Not yet, not out here, not until she had something more solid than a text from a paralegal. Because that information had the potential to undo Patrick Doherty in a way that deserved more than a parking lot conversation, and she needed him functional for whatever came next. He listened without interrupting, which she was starting to recognize as characteristic of him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He filed a false all clear, Patrick said, knowing you were still in there. Yes. That's not a bad call under pressure. That's not a hard decision in an impossible situation. He said it quietly, but there was something behind the quiet. That's deliberate. Yes. He looked at the memorial wall from across the parking lot. The names in the granite, the flags, the last of the wreaths. Marcus knew, he said, not everything. But he knew enough. He knew the investigation was wrong. He knew the timing was wrong. He knew that the people who should have been asking questions weren't. He stopped. He used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was make someone else's silence profitable. Claire looked at the wall too. Somewhere in the distance, on the edge of the reception tent, Vera Doherty was talking to a woman Claire didn't recognize, probably another family member, maybe a journalist, maybe nobody. Vera had her hand on the other woman's arm, and she was listening more than she was talking, which seemed exactly right for who she was. Claire's phone buzzed again. This time, the number was Sessler's. She answered. Ms. Rowan, I need you inside. Sessler's voice had changed. Brisk had become something harder and more compressed, the voice of someone managing simultaneous pressures. We're moving to the venue manager's office at the North Building. Farr is already there. Prast is on his way in. I've reached the duty officer at Fort Lavelle, and I have authorization to initiate a formal emergency review. I need your full statement on record before Briggs's legal representation arrives. His attorney's here? On the phone with him. They'll probably be on site within 90 minutes. A brief pause. Ms. Rowan, I want to be direct with you. What's in that signal log combined with the casualty record discrepancy you've identified? If the Halverson information checks out, this is not an administrative review anymore. This is a criminal investigation. Claire said, I understand. There may be things you say in the next 2 hours that you cannot unsay. I want to make sure you understand the weight of that. Major. She kept her voice even. I've understood the weight of this for 8 years. I'm ready. She ended the call and looked at Patrick. I have to go. He nodded. What can I do? Your mother? Does she have documentation of everything Marcus sent home? Letters, notes, anything? She kept everything. Shoeboxes, files on her laptop, printed emails. She's very organized about him. Something crossed his face briefly at that. She said it was how she kept him real. Tell her to keep it accessible. Sessler's office is going to want original copies of any correspondence that references the Korvalek operation or Briggs's name. She paused. And Patrick, tell her what I told you. She should know the shape of this before the official questions start. He looked at her for a moment. You're different than I expected, he said. She didn't ask what he'd expected. She said, take care of her, and meant Vera, and walked toward the North Building. Inside the venue manager's office, which was small and smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, Sessler had set up a field interview position with a digital recorder and a laptop. Farr was already there, out of his security coordinator role, and fully himself, collected, attentive, with a tablet loaded with 3 years of case documentation that he'd been carrying in the background of this event, like a loaded weapon waiting for the right moment. He looked at Claire when she walked in without surprise, without apology for the morning's interaction, without unnecessary explanation. You knew who I was when you walked over to check my badge, she said. Yes, he said. Why didn't you say something? Because I couldn't break my position without destroying 3 years of groundwork, and because I needed today to happen the way it happened, the letter, the dogs, the public record. I needed witnesses. He paused. I'm sorry it was uncomfortable. It wasn't your most significant call of the day. Something shifted in his expression at that. Not quite a smile, but close. Sessler brought the interview to order without ceremony. The recorder went on. Dates and identifications were stated. And then Claire Rowan, trauma nurse, former in bed with the 2nd Ranger Reconnaissance Detachment, sat down in a folding chair in a small office in Iron Ridge, Colorado, and said what she had been waiting 8 years to say, in full, On the record, with a federal investigator listening. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. She was precise and chronological, and she did not editorialize, and she did not cry, and she did not use language designed to be dramatic, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own without any help from her. She said what she had seen. She said what she had done. She said what she had heard on the radio. She said what had happened in the vehicle and what had happened in the 4 minutes when she'd heard the extraction team pulling back and had understood that she needed to move. She said that she had made it out and that she had believed both patients were still in the vehicle when it burned. When she said the last part, Sessler looked up from her notes. "You believed they were still inside?" "I was told they were. Later. In Germany. I was shown a casualty list. But you didn't personally confirm." "I was not in a condition to confirm anything in Germany. I had a grade 2 concussion and bilateral hearing damage from the explosion, and I had been awake for 40 hours. She said it simply. "I took what they told me because I didn't have the capacity to question it." Sessler was quiet for a moment. Then, "When did you find out Halverson might still be alive?" 45 minutes ago, in the parking lot." Sessler made a note. She looked at Farr. Something passed between them. The shorthand of people who had been working the same case from different angles for a long time and had developed the communicative efficiency of a shared language. Farr opened his tablet and turned it toward Sessler. "This came through from the Fort Lavelle records office while we were setting up," he said. "They pulled the full Korvalik operation file from classified storage at 0900 this morning per the IG complaint authorization." Sessler looked at the screen. Her stillness, this time, lasted 4 seconds. Then she looked at Claire with an expression that was not quite readable. Not shock, because Sessler did not appear to be someone who shocked easily, but the expression of a person confirming something they had been working toward and now had in their hands and needed a moment to make real. "There's a data card," Sessler said, "in the Physical Evidence Archive, filed under the Operations Logistics Inventory as communications equipment." She stopped. "It's labeled as a damaged recording device. It's been sitting in the archive for 8 years as listed equipment." "What's on it?" Claire asked. "It hasn't been accessed since it was filed." Sessler set the tablet down. "But the metadata on the file entry shows that it was submitted as evidence by the original investigating officer and then reclassified as non-evidentiary equipment by a supervising authority during the investigation closure review." "Reclassified by whom?" Sessler looked at her steadily. "The supervising authority signature on the reclassification form," Sessler said, "is Commander Nathan Briggs." The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of a room where something large has just stopped moving. "He buried his own evidence," Farr said. "Not to anyone in particular. Just to the room, because it needed to be said." Claire sat with that. The data card. 8 years in an evidence archive, mislabeled, signed over to non-evidentiary status by the man it implicated. Sitting in a box, in a storage facility at Fort Lavelle, waiting. "Can you access it?" she asked. "We already have a courier en route to the archive facility," Sessler said. "They should have physical custody within 3 hours." She paused. "And when they do, if the card contains what the original evidence log suggests it contains..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. What the log suggested was a full audio capture of the withdrawal sequence communications. Not the clean signal log Prast had kept. The raw field record. Every transmission. Every voice. Every second. Claire thought about Briggs's voice on that radio, 8 years ago, in a burning mountain pass in Afghanistan. That is final. She thought about what it would sound like played in a federal investigation room. She thought about how different it would be, how completely, irreversibly different, for that voice to be heard by people with the authority to act on what they heard, rather than by a 26-year-old trauma nurse in a burning vehicle who had no power and no recourse, and who had spent 8 years carrying the sound of it alone. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. Not the Fort Lavelle area code this time. Montana. She looked at it, looked at Sessler. "Can I take this?" Sessler gestured. "Go ahead." Claire answered. The voice on the other end was male, young, or young adjacent, the voice of someone who had been through enough that young wasn't quite the right word anymore, and it had the slightly effortful quality of someone for whom speaking clearly still required deliberate work. "Ms. Rowan," the voice said, "my name is Denny Halverson." A pause. Someone from the IG office called my VA case manager this morning. They said I needed to call this number. Another pause, shorter. They said you were there. At Korvalek. They said you... He stopped, started again. I remember a voice telling me to stay still. Claire put her free hand flat on the table. I remember, she said. The line was quiet for a moment with the weight of 8 years and everything that had happened inside them. They told me I was listed as KIA, Halverson said, the IG person. They told me what the record says. Yes. And they told me it was changed, that someone changed it. Yes. A sound on his end, not quite a breath, not quite not. Is it true? That you stayed? That you were still working on me when the order came? Claire looked at the wall across from the folding table. Plain white paint, a fire exit sign, a bulletin board with a paper schedule pinned to it. Nothing dramatic, nothing appropriate to the moment. Yes, she said. I stayed as long as I could. Why didn't they let you... He stopped, tried again. Why didn't... Denny. She said his name because he needed an anchor, and it was the one she had. We're going to fix the record. That's what's happening right now, today, in this room. Do you understand? A long pause. Yeah, he said finally, and his voice had the quality of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and was, very slowly, beginning to release. Yeah, I think I do. Claire kept her hand flat on the table and her voice steady, and she talked him through the next steps. What the IG office would need, who would be in contact, what to tell his VA case manager. And the whole time, in the back of her mind, running parallel to the conversation like a second current, she was thinking about a data card in an evidence archive 3 hours away from Iron Ridge, and about what was on it, and about the moment, coming now, close, real, when Nathan Briggs would hear his own voice played back in a room where running was no longer an option. She ended the call. Sessler was watching her. He's going to be a witness, Claire said. Yes, Sessler said. He is. Farr's tablet chimed. He looked at it. Something changed in his face, not alarm, not relief, but the controlled intensity of a person receiving information that changes the shape of what they're doing. The archive courier, he said, looking up. They've reached the storage facility. He paused. They found the data card. He paused again, longer this time, reading. It's not damaged, he said. The damage notation in the file was falsified. The card is intact. They're running a field read on it right now. The room held its breath. And then Farr looked at Claire Rowan with the expression of a man who had spent 3 years building toward this moment and was now standing inside it. There's a second voice on the recording, he said. Not Briggs, someone else on the channel. Someone who acknowledged the withdrawal order and then asked, on record, whether the Echo 7 position had confirmed evacuation. Claire went very still. Briggs told them yes, Farr said. Confirmed. Echo 7 clear. He looked at her. He said it 11 minutes before you actually got out of that vehicle. 11 minutes. Claire sat with that number, the way you sat with a medical finding that changed the differential entirely. Not reacting, not yet, just letting it settle into the right place so you could think around it accurately. 11 minutes. Briggs had told his own command that she was out of the vehicle 11 minutes before she actually cleared the door, which meant that for 11 minutes she had been working on 2 critically wounded soldiers in a position that command believed was empty, which meant that when the burn protocol was executed, when the vehicle was destroyed, it would have appeared to everyone with access to that secondary channel that the vehicle had been confirmed clear before destruction. No living witness to the abandonment, no record of a nurse who had stayed. Just a clean confirmation and a closed channel and a casualty list that conveniently removed the one patient who had survived long enough to remember a voice telling him to stay still. She said, "Who was on that secondary channel?" The voice that asked about Echo 7. Farr was still reading from his tablet. Captain Lena Ostroff. She was the base operations officer on duty that night. He looked up. She's currently a lieutenant colonel at Fort Lavelle. She's still active. Yes. And her question is on the recording. She asked whether Echo 7 had confirmed evacuation. Correct? Which means she had reason to check. She wasn't assuming, she was verifying. Farr and Sessler exchanged a look. That's one interpretation, Sessler said carefully. It's the accurate one. Claire kept her voice level. She had information that made her uncertain enough to ask. That's not procedure, that's doubt. She paused. Does she know about this investigation? As of this morning, no. The complaint was filed under seal. Sessler was already closing her notebook and reaching for her phone. That changes in approximately the next 15 minutes. The room reorganized itself around new priorities. Sessler stepped out to make calls. Farr continued pulling records on his tablet with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting 3 years for the moment when everything became actionable at once and was not going to waste it now that it had arrived. Claire sat at the folding table and drank the last of her terrible coffee and thought about Lena Ostroff asking a question 8 years ago on a secondary channel and then apparently accepting a false answer and doing nothing further with her doubt. The road between doubt and action was long and complicated, and Claire had lived on it herself for 8 years, so she was not in a position to be simple about it. But doubt asked out loud and then buried was a different category than doubt never expressed at all. Ostroff's question was on the record. She'd asked. Briggs had lied to her directly, on tape, and she had moved on. That was going to be an uncomfortable conversation for Lieutenant Colonel Ostroff before this week was finished. Outside the North Building's small window, the memorial grounds were emptying. The reception tent crew was beginning breakdown, folding chairs stacked, coffee urns disconnected, the temporary signage being detached from its frames. The flags would stay until tomorrow. The memorial wall would stay permanently, the names in the granite unmoved by any of what was happening in this room or in the parking lot where Briggs sat on the concrete barrier with his phone and presumably his attorney's voice in his ear, telling him to stop talking. He'd stopped talking. Claire had learned that from one of the junior IG officials who'd passed through the office briefly. Briggs had invoked his right to counsel about 40 minutes after Sessler's initial approach and had not said another substantive word, which was the legally correct move and also the move of a man who understood that the situation was no longer one he could talk his way through. That was its own kind of information. Patrick Doherty knocked on the office door at just past 2 in the afternoon, and Claire went to the door rather than inviting him in because the office was an active interview space, and Sessler hadn't cleared family members. He looked different than he had at the ceremony. Not worse, not better. Settled, in the way that people sometimes settled when the shape of a thing became clear, even if the thing itself was still unresolved. "My mother wants to know if you need her letters," he said. "She has them in the car. She brought them." She brought them today? She brought everything Marcus ever sent home, has been bringing them to every public event connected to his service for 6 years. He said it without apparent irony. In case someone asked, no one ever asked. He paused. Until today. Claire looked at him for a moment. Tell her yes. Have her bring them to Major Sessler. All of it. Originals if she has them, or copies, either one. He nodded. He didn't move immediately. How is it going in there? She thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without giving him information she wasn't authorized to share yet. It's going, she said. Forward. That's enough for today, he said, and left. She went back inside. Prast had arrived while she'd been at the door. He was at the table across from Farr, the original signal log printout spread between them, both men moving through the documents with the systematic focus of people who had spent careers reading technical records and could do it quickly. Prast looked up when she came back in. There's a name in the logistics inventory you should see, he said. He turned one of the pages toward her and pointed to a line item about 2/3 down the page. It was a communications equipment entry. Standard formatting, standard inventory number. Submitted by the original investigating officer, filed under the operations physical evidence log. The item description read, personal recording device damaged, non-operational. Submitted for evidence review per standing protocol. The submitting officer's name was Sergeant First Class Alton Marsh. Claire read the name twice. Alton Marsh had been the detachment's senior communications sergeant at Korvalik. She remembered him, a quiet, deliberate man who double-checked everything and kept paper records of his paper records because he didn't fully trust digital systems. He'd been in the command vehicle during the withdrawal sequence, which put him on the secondary channel, which put him as a witness to Briggs's communications. Where is he now? She asked. Prast said, he retired in 2019. He lives in Flagstaff. Has anyone contacted him? Farr's office has had him on the witness list for 14 months, Farr said without looking up from his tablet. He's agreed to cooperate. He's been waiting for someone to ask him the right questions under the right conditions. What are the right conditions? Farr looked up at that. A formal federal investigation with subpoena authority, he said, which is what we now have. Sessler came back into the room. Her face was still controlled, but there was something different in her posture. The tension of someone carrying multiple open lines simultaneously and managing the order of operations carefully. Ostroff has been notified, she said. She's been advised not to travel. Her commanding officer at Fort Lavelle has been briefed at the general officer level. A pause. She's requesting voluntary cooperation rather than formal compulsion. That's smart of her, Prass said dryly. It is. It also means she has something to say. Sessler set her phone face down on the table. The duty general at Fort Lavelle has authorized a formal military review board. It's not a court-martial, not yet, but it's the prerequisite step. The review board convenes Monday. She looked at Claire. We need your formal written statement before you leave today. You have the recorded interview. I need the written statement as a supplementary document for the review board packet. You can write it here or you can submit it electronically by tomorrow noon. She paused. I'd prefer here. Claire pulled out the chair she'd been sitting in and sat back down. Someone put a legal pad and a pen in front of her, and she picked up the pen and looked at the top of the blank page, and she wrote the date and her name and her former embed designation, and she started writing. She wrote for an hour and 20 minutes. She wrote it the way she documented medical cases, sequentially, specifically, without interpretation except where interpretation was directly relevant to procedure or decision-making. She wrote what she had seen, what she had done, what she had heard, in the order in which those things had happened. She wrote the request for 6 minutes. She wrote the radio response. She wrote the sound of the extraction team withdrawing. She wrote the 4 minutes she had stayed after the order, the moment she'd understood she needed to move, the exit from the vehicle, the explosion that had come 11 minutes after Briggs told command she was already clear. She wrote the 2 names, Erickson, Halverson. She wrote that she had been told both were dead. She wrote that she had signed paperwork in Germany on 40 hours of no sleep, with a grade 2 concussion and bilateral hearing damage, and that she had not been in a condition to verify what she was signing. She wrote that she had spent 8 years carrying the distance between what she knew and what the record said. When she was finished, she put the pen down, and her hand was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the writing. Sessler read it while Claire watched. The major read the whole thing without comment, turned back to 2 pages to reread specific sections, then set it down and said, "This is clear and usable. Thank you." It was a professional acknowledgement, not an emotional one, and Claire preferred that. Outside, the light had shifted to late afternoon, the particular gold gray of Colorado in November when the sun was angling toward the mountains and the temperature was dropping fast. The memorial grounds were empty now except for the flags and the wall and 2 maintenance workers coiling electrical cable near the reception tent frame. Briggs was still in the parking lot. His attorney had arrived, a man in his 60s in a good coat who had the look of someone accustomed to managing retired officers through difficult administrative situations. He was standing next to Briggs near one of the IG vehicles, talking low and steady. Briggs was listening with his arms crossed and his eyes down, and he had the posture of a man receiving information about the dimensions of the room he was in and finding them smaller than he'd expected. Claire watched this from the window for a moment before Farr came to stand beside her. "The data card is being transported to Fort Lavelle," he said. "They'll have a verified copy in the review board record by tomorrow morning." He paused. Sessler's also pulled Briggs's service record in full, the decoration he received for the Corps Valak operation. The citation cites specifically his leadership in successfully evacuating all personnel under fire. "All personnel," Claire said. "All personnel." She thought about that citation. She thought about a decorated ceremony where someone had stood in dress uniform and accepted acknowledgement for an action that had not happened the way the citation described. She thought about how the citation must have read to people who knew parts of the truth, to Prast, to Marsh, to Ostroff, with her unanswered question. How much weight you had to carry to keep something like that quiet. What you told yourself about it. "Marsh," she said, "the communications sergeant. He submitted the data card as evidence." "Yes." "He knew what was on it." He had to, Farr said. It was his recording device. He submitted it himself. He paused. The device was logged as damaged and non-operational, but Marsh was the one who logged it. He knew its actual condition. He hid it in the evidence record, Claire said slowly. In plain sight. Filed it as damaged equipment so it would be archived rather than accessed, but submitted it formally so it couldn't be destroyed without creating a paper trail. Farr said nothing. He was protecting it, Claire said, in case someone looked. That's what he told us when we contacted him 14 months ago, Farr said. He said, and this is a direct quote, I couldn't speak up then. I had a family, and I wasn't sure what would happen to me. But I could make sure the record didn't disappear. He paused. He's been waiting for this investigation for 4 years. Claire turned that over in her mind. The picture of a man spending years knowing that a thing existed and was true and was documented and still not being able to say it, because timing and circumstance and institutional power had specific weights that didn't always yield to individual courage, and sometimes the best a person could do was hide the truth carefully and wait. She understood that more than she wanted to. Sessler called the room to attention, not literally, but in the way senior officers brought a space into focus without raising their voice. Briggs's counsel has requested a voluntary compliance meeting, she said. As of 20 minutes ago, Briggs is prepared to provide a statement without compulsion. His attorney has advised him that cooperation at this stage is in his interest. The room absorbed this. What changed? Prast asked. Counsel has been briefed on the data card, Sessler said, and on Halverson. She let that sit. I don't think Briggs knew Halverson was alive. I think he believed his record alteration had been thorough enough that he'd removed that variable permanently. A pause. I was incorrect. That was the thing about falsifying a casualty record, Claire thought. It required the person you'd listed as dead to stay cooperative with your version of events. Halverson had simply survived, which was exactly what she'd been trying to give him. The conditions to do 8 years ago on a mountainside in Afghanistan with field materials, and 6 minutes she'd been denied. The meeting with Briggs and his counsel took place in a second room, a conference space off the main venue hall that the site manager had unlocked without asking any questions, clearly having read the room. Claire was not in that meeting. She was not supposed to be. She sat in the original office with Prast and waited, and Prast made coffee on a small machine in the corner that produced something marginally better than the reception tent urn, and they sat with it and didn't talk much because there wasn't much to say that the situation wasn't already saying. After 45 minutes, Farr came back. He sat down across from Claire and folded his hands on the table. He's admitted to the record alteration, Farr said. He's admitted to filing the false all clear on the secondary channel. He's disputing the intent characterization. His counsel is arguing a battlefield stress interpretation. But the admission on the factual conduct is on record. Claire said, and the data card? He's acknowledged submitting the reclassification order that moved it from evidentiary to non-evidentiary status. He's claiming he didn't remember the card's content at the time of reclassification. Farr's expression communicated his opinion of that claim without his saying so. The review board will evaluate that. His decoration citation. The review board packet includes a formal request for citation review. That's a separate process, Army Decorations Board. But Sessler has flagged it for parallel action. Farr paused. It won't happen this week. These processes have their own timelines. How long? Weeks to months for the review board. The citation review could be longer. He looked at her steadily. But it will happen. The record is too clear now. Claire looked at the window. Dark outside, early dark, November dark, the mountains invisible against the sky. She'd been in this building for almost 4 hours. She hadn't eaten since early morning. She was aware of being tired in a way she usually managed better, but today had been a specific kind of long that went beyond hours. What does he get? She asked. Administratively, what's the actual consequence? Farr said, for the record alteration, altering an official military document during an active investigation. That's a criminal charge under the UCMJ. His retired status doesn't remove jurisdiction for offenses committed while active. He paused carefully. For the false all clear, filing a knowingly false report that placed personnel at risk, that's a separate charge. The review board will establish the factual record, and then the JAG office takes it from there. And his honors. Revocation is a separate recommendation from the review board to the Secretary of the Army. But based on what's in the record now, he stopped. They won't survive the review. Claire sat with that. The decoration, the citation. 8 years of being the decorated commander who made a hard call under fire. Stripped of it, publicly and formally, by the weight of a data card that had been sitting in an archive for 8 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. She thought about Alton Marsh in Flagstaff, waiting 14 months for this call. She thought about Denny Halverson in Tucson, learning today that he existed differently than the record had said he did. She thought about Vera Doherty with her shoeboxes of letters, bringing them to every public event for 6 years in case someone asked. She thought about Marcus, 29 years old, writing a letter that said, "I know who asked for 6 more minutes and didn't get them." Sessler came back into the room and looked at Claire with the direct, calibrated attention she'd maintained all afternoon. "There's one more thing," Sessler said, "and I want to tell you before it appears in the formal paperwork, because you should hear it from a person before you see it in a document." Claire waited. In Briggs's statement, Sessler said, he confirmed that he was aware, at the time of the investigation closure, that your formal testimony submission had been prepared and was pending review. He confirmed that he applied administrative pressure to the investigation supervising officer to close the file before your submission was entered into the record. She paused. Your testimony was never lost. It was excluded, deliberately, before the investigation closed. The room was very quiet. Claire had known this, in the way you knew things you couldn't prove, the way you carried information that lived in your body and your memory and nowhere official. She had known it the way she knew what she'd heard on the radio and what she'd seen in that vehicle and what she'd been told in Germany. She'd known it the way knowing things without power felt, which was like carrying weight with no place to put it down. But hearing it confirmed in a federal investigation by the person who had extracted the admission from the man who had done it was different. It was a different weight entirely. She said, "He confirmed that on record?" "Yes." His counsel let him say that. His counsel is managing a situation where the data card and the signal log and Halverson's existence have made the factual record essentially uncontestable. At this point, voluntary admission of conduct with a cooperation credit is more useful to Briggs than denial. Sessler's voice was even. "It's the correct legal strategy. It doesn't make it feel better." "No," Claire said, "it doesn't." She looked at her written statement on the table. 12 pages, handwritten, the pen pressed slightly harder toward the end where her hand had been tired. 8 years reduced to a document that would go into a review board packet and sit alongside radio logs and data cards, and a dead man's letter, and the VA records of a man who had been listed as something he wasn't. She thought about what Farr had said. He said he couldn't speak up then, but he could make sure the record didn't disappear. "I want to call Halverson again," she said, "before I leave today." "Of course," Sessler said. "He's been told to expect follow-up contact from this office, but a personal call from you is appropriate." She paused. "You should also know that the review board will want him present in some capacity. His classification status will be corrected through a parallel administrative process before the board convenes." Denny Halverson was going to be officially alive in the military record by Monday morning. 8 years of not existing as a survivor, corrected in a week because a data card had been found, and a man had admitted what he'd done. Claire stepped out of the north building into the cold. The parking lot was partially empty now, most of the ceremony attendees long gone, a few vehicles remaining near the Memorial Grounds access road. Briggs's attorney's car was still there. One of the IG officials was outside leaning against a government vehicle and talking quietly on a phone. Farr came out behind her. "You should get something to eat," he said. "There's a diner on Route 9 that's open late." "Are we done for today?" "You're part of today, yes. The review board process starts Monday. You'll receive formal notification of testimony scheduling by Friday." He paused. "You don't have to stay in Iron Ridge." She looked at the memorial wall across the grounds, just barely visible in the dark, the granite catching the last of the site's exterior lighting, the names in it, the flags. "I know," she said. She called Halverson from the parking lot. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been near his phone, which meant he'd been waiting. She told him what Farr had told her, the review board, the timeline, the correction of his classification status. She told him it would take some time, but that the machinery was moving and that the record would be fixed. She kept her voice level, and she kept the information clear, and she didn't put more emotion into it than he could handle. Because Denny Halverson was a man who had rebuilt himself from significant damage and didn't need her feelings piled on top of his own. He was quiet for a long moment at the end of it. Then he said, "What happened to Erickson?" The question landed hard because she'd been waiting for it and dreading it simultaneously. "James Erickson died in the vehicle," she said. His injuries were more severe than yours. Even with 6 minutes, I don't know if the outcome would have been different for him." She paused. "I tried. I want you to know that. I was working on both of you until I had to move." Another long quiet. "I know," Halverson said finally. "I know you were." His voice was effortful and careful and real. "I could hear you working." She stood in the cold parking lot in Iron Ridge, Colorado, 8 years from a burning vehicle on a mountainside, and she let him hear her breathing for a moment because it was what she had. "I'll be in touch before Monday," she said. She ended the call. Patrick Doherty was waiting near his car, a sensible midsize with a University of Colorado parking sticker on the rear window. His mother was in the passenger seat, her silhouette visible through the glass, the flag probably still in her hands. "We're going to get dinner," Patrick said. "You should come." She thought about the diner on Route 9 and about the 5-hour drive back to Salter City that she wasn't going to make tonight because it was dark, and she was tired, and driving 5 hours in this condition was genuinely not safe. She thought about the review board on Monday and what she needed to do before then. She said, "Okay." They walked toward his car, and she was reaching for the rear door handle when Farr appeared at the building entrance behind them and said her name. Not loudly, but with the precision of someone used to carrying important information across distance without broadcasting it. She turned. He walked to her. "We've had a development," he said. He wasn't alarmed. His voice was still controlled, but there was something in it she hadn't heard before. "The data card. The Fort Lavelle Records team has been doing a full read. And? There are 4 hours of recording on that card." He paused. Marsh recorded the full withdrawal sequence. Every channel. The field record, the secondary channel, all of it. He looked at her steadily. "There's a segment from 40 minutes before the withdrawal order. Briggs on the command channel." Another pause. "He's discussing his promotion review, specifically the timeline, specifically the fact that a prolonged operation with additional casualty complexity would delay the review submission." Claire went still. "He didn't deny the 6 minutes because of tactical necessity," Farr said. "He denied it because he was worried about his promotion timeline." She heard that. She let it be real. "And then," Farr said, 11 minutes after the withdrawal, on the same channel, he makes a second call. To the base personnel office. He requests that the promotion review documentation be expedited." A pause. "He made that call while you were still in the vehicle." Patrick Doherty had gone very still behind her. She stood in the cold with Farr's words settling into the architecture of everything she'd known and suspected and carried for 8 years. And the last piece, the piece she'd never had, the piece that made the shape complete, clicked into place with the particular clarity of something that had always been true and was only now provable. He hadn't made a hard call. He hadn't weighed tactical reality against human cost and made an impossible choice under fire. He had chosen his career timeline over 2 critical patients and a nurse's life, and he had done it deliberately, in real time, on a recorded channel, and then he had spent 8 years building a false record around the decision to make sure no one could ever call it what it was. The review board convened Monday. The data card would be in the record Friday. And Nathan Briggs, sitting 30 feet away in the parking lot with his attorney and his admission and his collapse certainty, did not yet know that the recording had 4 hours on it instead of the 40 minutes anyone had expected, did not yet know that his conversation about the promotion timeline was sitting on that card as clearly as every radio transmission, waiting to be played in a room full of people with the authority to name what it was. His attorney's phone buzzed. Claire watched the attorney look at the screen. She watched his expression change. He turned to Briggs and said something low, and Briggs looked up, and for the first time since the parking lot concrete barrier, Briggs looked across the lot at Claire directly. Not with fear this time, not with the controlled blankness of earlier, with something that had no performance left in it at all, something that was underneath all of it, the thing that was left when everything else had been stripped away. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left that needed to be said between them. The attorney was already on his phone, and somewhere at Fort Lavelle, a records team was still going through 4 hours of audio, and on Monday, a review board would convene, and before any of that happened, Claire Rowan was going to have dinner with a dead soldier's family in a diner on Route 9, and the data card was going to keep existing in the evidence record, whether Nathan Briggs's attorney made 100 phone calls or none. Some things, once found, didn't go back into the dark. The diner on Route 9 was called Mora's, and it had been there long enough that the booths had been reupholstered twice, and the menu hadn't changed much either time. It smelled like coffee and griddle grease and the specific warmth of a place that stayed open when it didn't have to because the owner believed in being open. Claire slid into a corner booth across from Patrick and Vera Doherty and ordered eggs and toast because it was what her body wanted after a day like this one. Simple and caloric and real. And Vera ordered the same without comment, and Patrick got a burger and ate half of it and pushed the rest around his plate for a while. They didn't talk about Briggs or the data card or the review board over dinner. That wasn't a decision anyone made out loud. It just happened the way certain things happened when people were tired enough, and the day had been heavy enough that the mind stopped reaching for the next thing and just sat with what it had. They talked about Marcus instead. Patrick told a story about the time Marcus had gotten lost driving to their grandmother's house at age 16 and had refused to admit it for 45 minutes, insisting he was taking the scenic route until they'd ended up in a different county. Vera laughed at this, a real laugh, short and unguarded. And the sound of it was startling in a good way, like a window opened in a room that had been closed too long. Claire listened more than she talked. She was good at that, listening without performing listening, actually tracking what people said rather than preparing her response. Marcus had been like that too, she told them, when they eventually circled back to him. He'd had the kind of attention that made you feel like what you were saying mattered, even in circumstances that made most people too preoccupied to really hear. He got that from her, Patrick said, nodding at Vera. Vera looked at her coffee. He got it from his own life, she said. I just tried not to interfere with it. Claire left the diner at 9 and drove to a motel 6 miles outside Iron Ridge that had vacancies and a parking lot with decent lighting, and she lay on the bed without taking her shoes off and stared at the ceiling for a while. Not spiraling, just present, just sitting inside the day and letting it be as large as it was. She thought about Erickson. She thought about him more specifically than she usually let herself, because usually she kept it managed, kept it at clinical distance, because full contact with certain memories was not something you could do and still function on the other side. But tonight she let herself think about him clearly. James Erickson, 31, from somewhere outside Providence, who had a tattoo of a compass on his left forearm and who had been unconscious but breathing when she'd last had her hands on him, whose injuries had been severe enough that even with 6 minutes, she might not have changed the outcome. Might not. That was the part she lived in, the permanent uncertainty of the counterfactual. You could spend a lifetime in that territory, the things that might have been different if the circumstances had been different, and it would consume everything. She'd made a decision years ago not to live there. It wasn't a clean decision, it wasn't a resolved one, but it was the one she'd made, and she'd kept making it every time the alternative presented itself. What she could know was this: she had stayed. She had worked. She had asked for what she needed and been denied it, and she had stayed anyway until the last possible moment, and she had gotten one of them out alive even if the record had said otherwise for 8 years. That was real. That had happened. And now it was going to be in the official record instead of in her memory alone. And the distance between those two things was large enough that she couldn't fully measure it yet. She fell asleep with her shoes on and slept better than she had in months. The review board convened on Monday at Fort Lavelle, as scheduled, and Claire drove down from Iron Ridge the night before and stayed in a hotel near the base and spent the morning before her testimony drinking coffee and reading through her written statement twice to make sure she could deliver it without referencing the paper. Not for performance, but because she'd learned over years of giving difficult accounts that reading from a page created a layer of distance between you and the information that made people less certain about what you were saying, and she needed people to be certain. She testified for 3 hours. She was direct, and she was specific, and when the review board members asked questions, she answered them without hedging and without editorializing, and when a question was unclear, she asked for clarification before answering, because precision mattered more than speed in this room. The board was 5 officers, 2 colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, and a brigadier general who chaired the proceedings with the particular efficiency of someone who had sat through enough of these to know that the fastest way through was straight. At one point, one of the colonels, a woman, mid-50s, with a measured way of speaking that suggested she chose every word with awareness of its weight, asked Claire to describe the state of the patients when the withdrawal order was given. Claire described it, clinically accurately, in the language of trauma nursing, the specific injury presentations, the interventions she'd been performing, the realistic window for stabilization given the tools available. She described what 6 additional minutes would have meant in physiological terms, not emotional ones. She described what she had been able to complete and what she had not. When she finished, the colonel said, "In your professional assessment, was there any medical basis for the commanding officer's claim that continued extraction operations constituted unacceptable risk to the overall mission?" Claire said, "The risk assessment I can speak to is the medical one. The 6 minutes I requested would have extended the vehicle occupation by 6 minutes. The tactical evaluation of that risk was the commanding officer's to make. What I can say is that the medical justification for the extension was sound and documented in my field notes, which are part of the record before this board." The colonel nodded slowly. "And the field notes were submitted as part of your original testimony?" "My original testimony was excluded from the investigation record before the investigation closed," Claire said. "My field notes were attached to that testimony. They were not entered into the official record until this proceeding." The room was quiet for a moment. "For 8 years, the brigadier general said. Not quite a question. "Yes, sir." He looked at the record in front of him. "Noted," he said, which was the most the proceedings allowed him to say in the moment, but the way he said it was not nothing. Denny Halverson testified by video link from Tucson on Tuesday. Claire wasn't in the room for that. Witnesses didn't sit in on each other's testimony. But Farr told her afterward that Halverson had been clear and specific, and that the board had asked him to describe, in his own words, everything he remembered from the evacuation vehicle. He had described the voice. He had described being told to stay still. He had described the sound of the door and the movement of the vehicle, and then the long darkness of unconsciousness, from which he'd eventually woken up in a medical facility in Germany with a classification that said he was dead. Alton Marsh testified Wednesday by phone from Flagstaff. He walked the board through the communications archive process, explained how and why he had submitted the data card, explained the decision he'd made to file it as damaged equipment. He answered questions about the secondary channel transmission and confirmed, on record, that he had heard Briggs file the false all clear and had known at the time that it was false. "Why didn't you report it at the time?" one of the board members asked. Marsh's answer, which Farr relayed to Claire afterward, was this: "Because I was 29 years old and I was afraid of what would happen to my career, and I knew the investigation was being managed by the same people I would have been reporting to, and I made the wrong call. I've spent 6 years trying to find a way to partially correct that, which is what the card was." A pause on the line. "It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But it's what I had." Lieutenant Colonel Lena Ostroff testified Thursday. Her testimony, from what Sessler shared with Claire in summary form afterward, was complicated in the way that most honest accounts were complicated. She had heard Briggs's confirmation on the secondary channel. She had had doubts. She had not pursued them. She had told herself that the confirmation was authoritative and that questioning a superior officer's field report was outside her lane. She had not known about the data card. She had not known about the casualty record alteration. She had known that something felt wrong and had chosen not to look at it directly. She offered to cooperate fully with any further investigation. She accepted the board's notation of her conduct without objection. She did not make excuses, which, Sessler said, was the only thing in her account that would work in her eventual favor. Nathan Briggs testified Friday. His attorney had spent the week negotiating the parameters of his testimony, and what emerged was carefully structured: admission of the factual conduct, dispute of the intent characterization, acknowledgement of the record alteration, acknowledgement of the false all clear, an explanation of the promotion conversation that his counsel framed as the kind of logistics thinking that all officers did during extended operations, and that did not constitute the primary basis for the withdrawal decision. The data card didn't care about the framing. The data card had 4 hours on it, and the board had listened to all of it. When the chair asked Briggs directly whether he had been aware that Claire Rowan's formal testimony had been excluded from the investigation record, Briggs said he had been aware that the investigation was closed before her submission was entered. Were you aware that steps were taken to ensure that closure occurred before her submission could be entered? A silence. His attorney said, Commander Briggs has previously admitted, I'm asking Commander Briggs, the chair said. Another silence. Then Briggs said, Yes, I was aware. The room held that. The board deliberated for 10 days. Claire went back to Salter City after her testimony. She worked her shifts at the ER, Tuesday through Sunday, 12 hours, the familiar weight of it, the familiar problems and pressures, and the specific satisfaction of work that was immediate and concrete and demanded everything you had. She didn't tell her colleagues anything about Iron Ridge. They knew she'd taken a few days for personal reasons, and they didn't ask, which was one of the things she valued about working with people who were too busy to be curious about each other's private business. On the 6th day back, Denny Halverson called her. My records were corrected, he said. Yesterday. I got a letter. His voice had the careful quality she'd noticed the first time they spoke, the effort of it, but underneath that there was something new. A steadiness, a settledness, like a person who had been trying to stand on uncertain ground and had finally found something solid. It says the KIA notation was entered in error and has been corrected. Error. He said the word like he was turning it over. That's what they're calling it. For now, Claire said. The board's findings will be more specific. Yeah. A pause. I wanted to tell you. I don't know why exactly. I wanted you to know I got the letter. I'm glad, she said, and meant it simply. I've been thinking about what you said, he said, that you stayed as long as you could. Yes. I think I knew that. In the vehicle. I think I knew someone was still there. He stopped. I don't know if that matters. It matters, she said. The board's findings were released on a Thursday, 23 days after the review convened. Farr called her at 7 in the morning before her shift. She was in her car in the hospital parking lot with her coffee, and she listened to him read the summary findings out loud because he'd offered to, and she'd said yes because she'd decided she wanted to hear it as a human voice first before she read it herself. The board found that Commander Nathan Briggs had filed a knowingly false personnel status report during an active field operation. The board found that he had altered an official casualty record during an open investigation. The board found that he had applied institutional pressure to ensure that an eyewitness testimony submission was excluded from the investigation record before the investigation closed. The board found that the 4-hour communication recording demonstrated that the commanding officer's stated tactical rationale for the withdrawal order was materially inconsistent with his concurrent private communications regarding his promotion timeline. The board recommended criminal referral to the JAG office on 3 separate charges. The board recommended formal citation review to the Army Decorations Board for revocation of the Valor Decoration issued for the Korvalik Ridge operation. The board recommended that the official Korvalik Ridge operation report be reopened and corrected to accurately reflect the conduct of all personnel, including civilian embed trauma nurse Claire Rowan, whose actions during the withdrawal sequence the board characterized as, Farr's voice slowed here, reading carefully, demonstrating exceptional commitment to the welfare of wounded personnel under conditions of direct personal risk, including remaining in a designated high-risk area beyond the official withdrawal order and providing continued medical intervention to 2 critically injured soldiers. The board also recommended that the historical record be corrected to reflect the accurate status of PFC Denny Halverson as a survivor of the Korvalik Ridge operation. Farr stopped reading. Claire sat in her car in the hospital parking lot with her coffee going cold in her hand. There's one more thing, Farr said, at the end of the findings. It's not standard language. The chair added it as a personal notation. Read it. It says, the board notes that the exclusion of Ms. Rowan's testimony from the original investigation record represents an institutional failure that compounded the harm already caused by the conduct under review. The board further notes that Ms. Rowan's decision to appear at the Redstone Veterans Memorial on November 7th, which initiated the chain of events leading to this review, required a degree of personal courage that is consistent with the conduct documented in the field record. The board commends her cooperation with this proceeding and expresses the acknowledgement of this body for her patience in waiting for a process that should not have taken 8 years to begin. Claire was quiet for a moment. That's not standard language, she said. No, Farr agreed. It's not. She looked out the windshield at the hospital entrance. The automatic doors opening and closing for the morning shift change. People in scrubs moving in and out. The ordinary machinery of a place that existed to keep people alive. She'd worked in a building like this one for most of her adult life. She'd chosen it deliberately after coming home from Korvalek, because it was what she knew and because the work was real, and because patients didn't know or care about anything except whether you showed up and did your job. She'd been showing up and doing her job for 8 years while the record said something different than what had happened. The record was going to say something different now. Thank you, Gideon, she said. She used his first name because they'd earned that, somewhere in the last 3 weeks. Thank you, he said. You did the hard part. She went inside and worked her shift. The JAG referral moved through the system over the following months with the speed of a process that had been handed a complete evidentiary record and didn't need to spend time building what was already built. Nathan Briggs was formally charged in February, 3 counts, as the review board had recommended. His retirement benefits were suspended pending the criminal proceeding. His counsel entered a plea agreement in April that avoided trial and resulted in a formal conviction on 2 of the 3 counts, a reduction in rank, and a sentencing that included forfeiture of a portion of his retirement pay and a permanent bar from any federal employment or contracting. The Army Decorations Board completed its review in March and issued its findings in May. The Valor Decoration for the Korvalek Ridge operation was formally revoked. The citation was expunged from the official record. The public announcement was brief and administrative and buried in a Friday afternoon release, because these things were always buried in Friday afternoon releases. But it was there, permanent, part of the archive. The corrected Korvalek Ridge operation report was published in June. It ran to 47 pages and contained a full accounting of the operation, including the withdrawal sequence, the field actions of the medical personnel, and a corrected casualty record that listed James Erickson as killed in action and Denny Halverson as wounded in action and evacuated. It listed Claire Rowan's actions in the field in a dedicated section that Sessler had personally reviewed for accuracy. She read that section 3 times. It was accurate. Every word of it was accurate. It was just the record, finally, saying the same thing as the truth. 6 months after the Iron Ridge ceremony, the Redstone Veterans Memorial held its rededication. The new historical marker was unveiled on a Saturday in May, when the mountains were finally clear of snow and the air had the thin, clean quality of high altitude in spring. There were more people than the November ceremony. The combination of better weather and the fact that what had happened in November had traveled, quietly but widely, through the veterans community and the families connected to the 2nd Ranger Recon Detachment. Farr was there in civilian clothes, Prast was there, Sessler was there in dress uniform, Vera Doherty was in the front row with the flag and a new coat. She'd gone shopping, Patrick had mentioned, which was how he knew she was doing better. Denny Halverson was there. He'd driven up from Tucson, which was a 17-hour drive because he'd said he wanted to see the wall with his own eyes and stand in front of it and be officially alive while he did it. I was tall, and he walked with a slight asymmetry that was probably going to be permanent, and he had a quietness to him that wasn't absence but presence. The particular quality of someone who had been put back together from something serious and knew exactly how much that had cost. He and Claire had spoken on the phone 4 more times since November and had texted occasionally, the brief practical kind of texting where you conveyed information without a lot of language around it, which suited them both. He looked at the wall for a long time when they arrived. Then he said, "Marcus Doherty." "Yes," she said. "I knew him a little. Not well." He was looking at the name. "He was funny. Unexpected." "Yes." They stood there together for a while, not filling the silence, which was the right thing to do with it. The ceremony was shorter than November's, less formal, more human. Colonel Whitfield spoke again, but briefly. Patrick read a section of Marcus's letter, not the full thing, just the end of it, the part that named Claire. And then the historical marker was unveiled, a bronze panel mounted to the left of the main granite wall, listing the forgotten rescuers of the Redstone-affiliated operations. The names were alphabetical. Claire Rowan was near the bottom. She saw it and felt something she didn't try to analyze or name. Vera Doherty came to stand beside her while people were still gathering around the new marker, reading the names. "He was right," Vera said. Claire didn't need to ask who she meant. He said you were the kind of person who made other people remember what they were supposed to be, Vera continued. I've been thinking about that for 6 months. What it means. She looked at the marker. I think he meant that you showed up when it was hard and stayed when it was harder, and that when people see someone doing that, it reminds them that it's possible, that it's a thing a person can actually do. Claire looked at her name on the bronze panel. He gave me too much credit, she said. You've been giving yourself too little for 8 years, Vera said, and it was not gentle exactly, but it was kind. Those are different problems. After the rededication, there was a reception again. Better coffee this time. Vera had apparently provided input, and people moved around and talked and found each other, and Claire stood near the edge of things the way she usually did and watched it unfold. The K9 unit had come back. Rook was there, older looking than he had been in November, even across 6 months, with Vance beside him, and when Rook located Claire in the crowd, he made his way to her side with the unhurried certainty of an animal that had made up its mind about a thing and saw no reason to revisit the decision. She put her hand on his head. Vance watched this with the same expression as November, still not quite having a category for it, probably never going to have one, which was fine. He retires in the fall, Vance said. He's been designated for a K9 care program with a veteran's family. Good placement. He paused. I thought you should know. Thank you, she said. A reporter from the Veterans Affairs publication that had run the original rededication notice in November had been credentialed for the event and had been quietly present all morning. She found Claire near the end of the reception, late 20s, with the particular directness of someone who had learned to ask hard questions without apologizing for asking them. Miss Rowan, she said, I'm writing the piece on the rededication and the board findings. I'd like to include your perspective if you're willing to talk. Claire looked at her. She thought about all the times over 8 years she'd chosen not to talk. Not because the truth wasn't available, but because there was no structure to receive it, no one with authority to act on it, no mechanism that would convert her words into anything other than more weight she'd have to carry afterward. The mechanism existed now. Okay, she said. The piece ran 2 weeks later. It was accurate and it was fair and it didn't reach for drama because the facts didn't need help being dramatic. It named Briggs. It named the charges and the outcome. It named the data card and what was on it. It described the rededication and the historical marker and the corrected operation report. It quoted Halverson briefly and quoted Prast briefly, and it quoted Claire 3 times, none of the quotes particularly long, all of them specific and direct in the way her speech was. The piece also quoted the letter. Marcus's words, read at a ceremony in November by a chaplain's assistant in the cold. I know who asked for 6 more minutes and didn't get them, and I know who those 6 minutes would have been for. Claire read the published piece on her phone on a Sunday morning before her shift, sitting in the same parking lot where she'd taken Farr's call 2 months earlier. She read it once, straight through, and then she put her phone face down in the cup holder and sat with it. She thought about the thing Vera had said, that showing up and staying when it was hard reminded people that it was possible. She thought it was probably true. She also thought it was a more generous interpretation than the thing felt like from the inside, which was less like demonstrating possibility and more like not having a good mechanism for doing anything else. She hadn't stayed in that vehicle because she was trying to show anyone anything. She'd stayed because there were 2 men in front of her who were alive, and the training and the instinct and the basic human arithmetic of the situation said that staying was the correct thing to do and leaving was not, and she had never in her life been good at doing the incorrect thing just because it was easier. That wasn't heroism. That was just her particular kind of stubbornness, which had cost her 8 years and which she would deploy again in the same situation without hesitation. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she could say about it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Halverson. Read the piece. You sound like yourself. She smiled at that. A real one, slightly crooked. She typed back, good. She thought about the Institutional Review Board recommendation language that Farr had read to her over the phone. The acknowledgement, the commendation, the notation about patience in waiting for a process that should not have taken 8 years to begin. She didn't need the notation to know what had happened. She'd always known what had happened. But there was something in being officially known, in the record finally matching the reality, in the institution that had failed her formally acknowledging the shape of that failure, that released a weight she hadn't been able to accurately measure while she'd still been carrying it. 8 years was a long time to wait for a correction. But the correction had come. And here was the thing she'd learned, the thing she kept coming back to in the weeks since the rededication, the thing that felt true in a way that didn't require idealization or cleanup to remain true. The waiting hadn't broken her. The exclusion hadn't erased what she'd done. The false record hadn't changed the actual events. Halverson was alive because of work she'd done in a burning vehicle on a mountainside, and that had been true every day for 8 years, regardless of what any document said. And it had remained true even on the days when she couldn't prove it and no one in authority was listening. The truth had a way of existing independently of the record. The record just needed to eventually catch up. She picked up her coffee, got out of her car, and walked into the hospital for her shift. The automatic doors opened and the familiar smell of the place came out to meet her. Antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular aliveness of a building full of people working very hard to keep other people breathing. And she walked in and put on her badge and started her day. She was, as she had always been, exactly where she chose to be. And now the record knew it too.